Hello, you found Lisa talking again. So this is the next in our weekly series on what's keeping the UK stable as we enter into a post-Brexit, post-coronavirus world where the economics of the 20th century is over and where we have danced ourselves off the world stage. I started the series looking at the death of the Labour Party and looking at how this political party, which had formed like a considerable part of our story of the journey towards democracy, had ended by literally facilitating a policy reflex that kind of killed about 100,000 people, seeking out those people in social movements using abuse and intimidation, and had led to them literally turning their supporter base on Jewish people while revealing that our trade unions don't work because they're preoccupied with the Labour Civil War. I showed that this was actually a symptom of a stable country and that democracy had taken care of this problem, as it was always going to. And in the next video I looked at what's keeping the UK stable, and I looked at all the different sources of stability at this period of time where we are in flux to a new age. Then last week I looked at the decision to leave the European Union and the decision around Brexit and what had led to it, and how complacency had led to a very poor decision to hold this referendum, and that actually it wasn't really the decision to leave the European Union that was the problem, but actually the threat of launching a fascist wave on the world and the loss of our reputation for stability as a country, which was now going to damage our economy and our political relationships. Now, I want to have a look as we go on in the rest of this series. There's only 2 more videos left looking at how the context has changed globally while we have been caught in this little whirl. And I wanted to look at the economics of the 20th century, which is now as dead as a dodo, and what it had been and where it had come from and where it had lost its way. Because it's actually not complicated. You don't have to be a genius to understand this. Now, the root word of economics is oikos, which is a Greek word that means household. Because the economy is not a complicated abstract thing. It's where you spend your money. It's the systems that you use. It's, you know, what maintains political stability. It's about the distribution of resources. And what it's supposed to be about is about a world where we have learned that we have to have a belief system shaping our policy in democracies, which actually can see the economy, that knows what's happening, that responds to it. But in actual fact, when I attended the LSE in 2015, what I found was that we are actually using the same economics that the original man that tried to that is at page 1 of Modern Economics had tried to kill. Now, there are only 2 texts that you need to understand modern economics, really, if I'm honest. The first one is page 1 of Modern Economics, and it's a book by a man called John Maynard Keynes called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And it's a book written by a very frightened man as a response to the Treaty of Versailles, which was a treaty that kind of came out of the end of World War I. And this very frightened man who had watched this happen said, if we do this, if this is the Treaty of Versailles, this is going to lead to more conflict, because the blindness to power relations within this treaty, the grab for resources, is going to lead to more conflict. And in actual fact, it led very directly to World War II, and is why John Maynard Keynes was at the core of wartime economics in World War II. In actual fact, many of the national boundaries that were dictated as a consequence of this treaty are still playing out in instability in the Middle East, with us at its root, which is partially why the economics of the 20th century is over and the world has moved away from us and is continuing while we have danced ourselves off the world stage. The other text that you need is a text called Road to Serfdom, which is written by an Austrian man called Friedrich Hayek. Now, Friedrich Hayek was an incredibly perceptive but very, very misunderstood man. He often said that he was as misunderstood by the people who claimed to be big fans of his as he was by those who he actually sought to challenge. Now, Road to Serfdom started off as a letter to a man called William Beveridge, and he's the architect of the UK benefit system that's currently in crisis now. And what Friedrich Hayek said to him as he started this letter, which turned into one of the most significant books of the 20th century, was that if you have a centrally planned system for welfare, that is shaped around a centrally controlled money supply, that is blind to the power that is exercised by that system, and where you think you are doing good and there is no way to challenge you, that system will undermine the rule of law, and it will harm the very people that it's trying to help. It will cause people who are already marginalized in society to be targeted and grouped up, and it will literally damage your democracy and cause chaos. Now, there's a lot of modern people who think they are adherents of Friedrich Hayek who could do with actually reading that book, because actually this man was absolutely terrified. Now, the reason he was frightened was because he was a man who was writing in response to the atrocities of World War II in the midst of World War II. He was an Austrian who was part of a number of Austrians who had to leave their homeland because of the rise of the Nazis, and they were very much influenced by a mathematical school called the Vienna Circle. Now, the Vienna Circle was a really, really important school of mathematicians who made great leaps. These were very, very clever men, but many of them ended up either in concentration camps or being killed by the Nazis, and then others ended up leaving. Ludwig von Mises is another one. And these men were passionate defenders of liberal democracy, and they weren't talking about the media democracy now. They weren't talking about the power of finance, and they weren't talking about the left-right kind of nonsense that you see in the political press. What they were talking about was the democracy that should have stabilized the part of the world that they were from in a period where actually Vienna and Austria had descended into chaos. Now, World War I was very much about the world moving past monarchy. Most of the people who fought in World War I had never voted. This was about a world kind of moving past monarchy, and democracy was very, very, very young. And what these men were saying, these men were incredible mathematicians, but they were also shaped by the political reality of watching the country that they love just descend into hell, into a conflict that ended up killing 60 million people, and centrally planned institutions being used at the root of concentration camps, which killed 6 million Jewish people, something which had killed many of their colleagues. Now, what you'll notice about Keynes and Hayek is they were not left and right at all. These were men who had been shaped by watching global conflict. Both of them were triggered by fear of a recurrence of that conflict and the horrors that they had seen, been part of, or escaped. Now, there's an interesting man called Hyman Minsky who reclarified Keynes's thoughts on instability and actually reread Keynes. And one of the things that I didn't say, I did a tour of my bookshelves the other day, and there were quite a lot of economics books on these shelves, there always are. But what I didn't point out was that over there are about a shelf and a half of economics books that I never read. I never read, and I never look at them because they are bunk. They are the economics books that were written in the last quarter of the 20th century, as the earlier ideas of these men had been picked for tiny, tiny bits and then placed in an economics that's actually bunk economic modelling. It's not mathematical modelling, it's not measuring anything, but it's based on nonsense ideas about growth for the sake of growth, using debt. Now, debt will actually hold, what Minsky identified was that actually the expansion in debt during periods of boom will actually lead to complacency and financial crisis. And this is absolutely true. In 2008 we saw a global financial crisis which threatened to collapse the world economy, because we were using an economics which was blind to debt, blind to the rule of law, and blind to everything, because the mathematical modelling at its root, which is now completely outdated, wasn't actually measuring the economy at all. It was nonsense fantasies by men who were bred by periods of stability, where if they could just get rich and get rich quick, everything would be all right. And in actual fact, this is kind of what Minsky was saying, what Hayek was saying, and what Keynes was saying. The difference between economic and maths is that the context changes around maths, around economics. Social change happens, institutions grow, society changes. In World War I, most people couldn't even vote. you know, the latter half of the 20th century saw fundamental changes to the organisation of family structure. Women changed the family structure from one of ownership to one of reciprocity. We saw the emergence of social care. We saw the emergence of health systems, the maturation of welfare systems that had been established in World War II. Now, when you're actually looking at people during periods of crisis, if you look at kind of the dysfunction that's caught on Twitter, what you'll see is lots of people trying to invent that these problems are caused by some invisible kind of Machiavellian conspiracy, and this is very rarely true. In actual fact, most of our economic problems are caused by complacency about the fact that we are a stable country and we do not know that systems renew through crisis, because we don't have big crisis often enough domestically. Institutions change and grow over time. Policymakers can't know everything. Crises are often where they find out what systems do. And in actual fact, the lessons that Friedrich Hayek actually kind of tried to get across in the 40s did not get embedded in modern economics. They are found in other areas of the economy. Social work, child protection are the systems in Britain that are shaped by crisis. The development of the rule of law in this area is about tragedy and crisis, where it's the worst that people can do. Baby P, Victoria Climbié, the Cleveland Inquiry, these are what contributes to the development of these systems. You can't actually do much with an institution while it's stable. You have to wait till a period of crisis, and in that moment you'll get all the information that you need, and it's at those moments that you have to kind of have systems which learn from crisis. In 2008, if we had responded to the global financial crisis by saying the economic belief system that we are using cannot see something, and asked methodically what systems have evolved and what has changed since the last crisis of this type, we could have come up with policy which actually addressed the financial crisis. And to a certain extent, that's what our financial regulation institutions did. But politically, what we did was a reflex response. The public wanted a punitive response to welfare claimants to show that something was being done. We saw an expansion in abusive use of our welfare system, and just as Hayek predicted, we actually saw a policy reflex which killed about 100,000 people in broad daylight. And in that period, Labour showed that their political model was to use social movements to subordinate people and actually sought out people who were being harmed by policy and further harmed them to kind of protect their self-image. And now they are caught in a narcissistic bubble on Twitter and they can't be elected again. Now, the 20th century in Britain was actually very, very, very stable. The system that Beveridge established, this welfare system, established a media blueprint for our welfare system which involved political narrative. So he released a report called The Five Giants to kind of save a bill that was jeopardized to make sure this bill would pass. It was utter nonsense. It contained nothing. But the system that he actually devised was then delivered by the civil service. And the civil service by nature respond to the context changing around them. They have the rule of law at their root. They remain neutral and separate and deliver policy impartially. So the problems embedded then within it did not become apparent until this actual reflex as a response to the financial crisis. But what's important to understand about the financial crisis is it was the consequence of a form of thinking that had actually been about facilitating a credit boom. Now, I remember the credit boom in this country. I'm not being funny. The people in this country who think they didn't want the credit boom, they're lying. This was a period of we felt like it was a period of extreme prosperity. People felt richer than they had ever felt. Credit was flowing. I remember I had like 3 credit cards, I've never had a credit card since. People were shopping and there were restaurants and everybody felt like this was actually, this bubble that we were in would never end. But it was a bubble. And it was a bubble that actually threatened to bring down the global system. Now, the other thing that we actually failed to consider in this country was that actually our economics was part of a way of kind of dominating the world. You know, UK-US dominance. When Thomas Piketty is writing Capital in the 21st Century, which is a very flawed book about what economics can't see, and you're better off reading his academic supervisor, Anthony Atkinson. But what he says is he's like, I'm sure there's some kind of system of hegemony that I just can't see. Well, the reason he can't see it is because he's up at the top, and you often can't see that a system of subordination is a system of subordination when you are the one doing the subordinating. And what you see on Twitter is the efforts that Westminster has gone to in the last 10 years to maintain their ignorance of the context that changed around them and the amount of people harmed by this economics. There's nowhere that this has been more graphically seen than in the Labour Party using Twitter to seek out vulnerable people who would be harmed by welfare reform, and newspapers like The Guardian and trade unions like PCS, Unite, you know, actually being behind political movements that were outright designed to subordinate and silence those people so that policy could harm them. Now, when I attended the LSE in 2015, what I found was they were using a synthetic modelling that was out of date. This is not mathematical modelling. This is fantasy making using very complicated models that look like maths. But in actual fact, the world has now changed technologically, and we have data capabilities which mean for the first time in our history, we don't have to hypothesize about the ideal economy because we can measure the one that we have. We have the capacity to use data in a way that we have never had before. But we have lost the opportunity to respond to the context changing around the economics that we've used, because for 10 years, policymakers, think tanks, and media organizations who no longer have the power of broadcast have been using Twitter to demonstrate what went wrong. Now, what I'm going to look at in the next video is I'm going to look at how the global context has changed while our media cultures have been locked in this bubble on Twitter. I'm going to look at how their economics differs to ours, how they have responded to policy shaped by our economics, and why they have moved past us. And I'm going to look at some of the machinations that have been occurring under the coronavirus blanket with the world changing away from us, and I'm going to look at how some powers have been able to exploit the weakness generated by Twitter to literally try and generate instability within this country while we have been blind to it. So that will be next Wednesday, and we're coming to the last two videos of this series, which are about how the global context has changed while we have danced ourselves off the world stage. Thank you very much for listening to me today. I'm still crowdfunding £350 for research materials and equipment. My PayPal's underneath. I'm really, really liking Patreon because I can actually talk to people without the narcissism of Twitter and without the trolls. And you can kind of reach me on Patreon, or you can leave messages underneath and I'll respond to them. Like, I really am beginning to quite like having the comments open, although I'm sometimes a bit crabby. I'm really sorry. But that's because I'm not really used to having the comments open. I will be back on Sunday with a continuation of our history series. And I'll be looking at the strip of land that in the Bible is called Canaan, and in the modern day world is Israel, and also the Jordan Valley. And I'll be looking at that on Sunday. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me today. It's been a pleasure. I'll speak to you soon.